some of the ideas that we're discussing, and I want to take the discussion a little bit further, and then we'll start going through the Maimarim that we discussed. So number one, there are two versions of a Talmudic statement, and the Rebbe would juxtapose one of them, one versus the other. Ani nivreti l'shamesh et koni, I was created to serve my master, to serve my creator. Or ani lo nivreti ella l'shamesh et koni, my only purpose of creation was but to serve my creator. Anybody have a reflection on the difference between those two?
Well, it's exactly opposite. What else can there be?
Opposites?
One says you were created to work your Shem, and the other one says I was born only not to work my.
No. Ani lo nivreti ella.
That was the first one.
The first one was.
The second is a contrapositive of the first.
Okay, there we go. So,
okay,
a little bit beyond my grammatical capabilities.
So the first one,
it's the negative of the negative, which means it's the same thing.
One of the things I was created for is to work Hashem. The second one specializes it just to work Hashem.
Right. So you were saying it's a negative, and Ezra, I think what that was, he was saying that it's the same thing. If it's a contrapositive, teaching me something today. Is it truly the same thing?
Is what?
Are the two quotes truly the exact same thing?
Not the exact same thing.
Two negatives.
But I'm sorry. Okay,
no, go ahead. Go ahead, Ben.
I go ahead. I'm muted.
No, you're not.
Okay, no, I'm not. The difference is that one limits you, that you are only born to do one thing.
Okay, that's one way of looking at it.
The first one lets you do anything you like, but you also were born to work Hashem.
Interesting. Okay, that's one way of looking at it. Well, the Rebbe's take on it is that the first one makes a general statement. The second one makes an incredibly focused statement. So the double negative here stresses the idea that this is truly our purpose of creation. And it eliminates anything else. So what Ben's saying is basically a little bit in line, but I'm positive.
And do you think they care either?
If we hang on a second. If we focus on the negative, that we can't do anything else, then obviously that becomes a very frustrating experience. So the Rebbe's take on it is that when we consider our creation, why was I put here in the first place? The general statement, of course, is that, all right, I need to serve my creator in a general form, but that general form is not all inclusive. Then as soon as you start getting to ani lo nivreti ella l'shamesh et koni, the contrapositive here stresses the idea that any element of myself, all inclusive of any details whatsoever, is for the purpose of serving my creator. And the brilliance of that is that brings up some of the ideas that we've been discussing. That, of course, people have flaws, and we have, family histories, and we have personal histories that seem to very much get in the way of serving God. And by taking this perspective, it eliminates all of that. Because even those factors which you might consider to be negative towards the idea of serving God are actually themselves meant to be part of that process. And so that concept is crucial as we kind of start flowing through these Maimarim, the general ideas of the Maimarim that I'd like to take out. Robert, you had a question or a comment?
Oh, no, I'm fine. Thank you.
All right. So we're going to start with the most recent mimer that we discussed, which talks about the, let's see, hold on a second. There we go. About the general process. So the first stage of the process we said was Nisan, which is the idea of escaping from Pharaoh and escaping from slavery. And that's done by subjugating oneself, subduing oneself, moving out of the evil. That's the first part of the process, which we described using the term itkafia. And this is also related to something that we discussed in Basi Legani, which also used the term itkafia. And he used the quote that when one subdues the negativity, the other side, the glory of Hashem is spread throughout all the world. So the brilliance over here is that when a person gets involved in negativity, a person gets, let's say a person is not acting in a religiously Jewish way, they're not keeping Shabbat, or maybe could be something far worse with regards to sins that are immoral or something like that. So a person can automatically assume that as a result of that, the whole thing's over. There's no point in progressing or attempting to repair the relationship or anything of this sort. The person has to realize that actually that the circumstance that they find themselves in is for the purpose of escape. So it's no longer just something, okay, I did wrong, I failed. Now they have to look at the situation as a motivational movement that this circumstance that I was in is for the purpose of going up. If you're going to say that, you're going to take the first quote, that I was created for the purpose of serving my Creator, and I'm not, therefore there's no point to my whole life. I'm not doing it, and so therefore life is, for all intents and purposes, pointless at this point. On the other hand, when you say my only creation is for the purpose of serving God, using that contrapositive, I love that word, thank you, Mr. Levi. We are now realizing that any circumstance that we find ourselves in is itself an opportunity to serve God. And that what we've started learning in the Maimarim is that that's not just a way to feel good about ourselves. That's actually something that's crucial in the schematic of creation. So we mentioned this idea that God relates to the world in two different ways. In a way of mimali kalamin, in a way that God infuses the world with each individual's particular creation, and the way of sovev in such a way that is transcendent of the world, that any situation, no matter as it is completely, infinitely below God. God is completely transcendent of anything. And so even if you're going to talk about the highest of spiritual worlds and spiritual states like Atzilut, in which godliness and humanity, or godliness and any existence within that particular state is completely unified with godliness, still Atzilus is totally the same, completely the same, totally equal to the world that we live in, the world of Asiya. And what we explained is that when a person is able to transcend by subduing themselves, even at the slowest stage, they're able to cause the soviv aspect of godliness to be able to permeate the world. And because God is not just found in holiness, God can be found even in the worst circumstances that we are, and God is found in those circumstances when we transcend ourselves. So that first stage of escape from godliness is not just a step out, it's actually a crucial element of the entirety of creation. Creation was created for the purpose of transcending even the transcendent. And this was an idea that we brought in several Maimarim, taking different angles. On the one hand, we explained in Lo Tiyeh Meshakela that God, we're asking the question of, does God care about my service? Does he care that I serve? And the answer is yes, God cares that you serve, but the details are not as important to him as the concept that you serve in general. And when a person does serve, you're able to absorb the aspect of Sovev into your world. And bshaa shekhikdimu, we also spoke about the same kind of concept, that a person can reach the idea of drawing Sovev into the world through one's own self-nullification. And that's the concept of teshuvah. And that was also the concept that we reminded ourselves in the Maimar of the Isha Achat, when we spoke about the woman would be able to live, Vat tichyi banotar, you will be able to live on the extras, so to speak. We explained that through the avodah of teshuvah, you're able to be energized from this transcendent level of godliness. You're able to live off of, to have energy and to drive yourself through that transcendent level. So that's the first stage, is of course escape. And we spoke about the concepts of escape. How do we escape? In the Maimar of Isha Achat and the Maimar of bshaa shekhikdimu. Bshaa shekhikdimu really spoke about just subduing your own desires. And in Lo Tiyeh Meshakela, we spoke about the concept that subduing your desires is crucial, even at higher levels of serving God. That even spiritual desires, as soon as a person is self-focused and self-absorbed, then they're really getting back stuck on themselves. But the Isha Achat gave us the mechanism to do so, which is the idea of the empty vessels. That just do things, even though right now they're empty, but eventually they will fill themselves. And we also spoke about the idea of that a person has to be an empty vessel, that a person has to allow themselves to receive as opposed to being full of themselves. Some of those ideas sound familiar? Any comments here, or is everybody just frozen?
No. I have a comment.
Susan, go ahead.
Yeah, I have a comment. I have always believed that at the moment of conception, when there's a child being created, that is the beginning of service to God. There may be no way of self-awareness, but the mere fact of two chemicals coming together is a God creation, and that is beginning the service.
I would absolutely agree that is the beginning of the process, but at that point, the soul does not have the capability yet of actually serving God. At that point, the soul is still in a state, and has not been given the body, and the body does not have its own self-existence to be able to struggle with.
Right. It's still in the embryonic state. It doesn't have any consciousness at this point.
And how do you know that, Robert?
We don't know anything.
Well, the soul does have its own consciousness.
We have no way of measuring consciousness at that level at this point.
Right.
But God can certainly measure consciousness.
Ben, go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to say, I'm thinking that when you said you have to be an empty vessel to receive, actually it means the same thing as bitul.
Yes, exactly.
So what does that mean?
That's exactly.
You nullify yourself.
Bittul
you're
is the
like an empty
nullification that we've.
vessel.
But how can you nullify yourself if you have no consciousness?
Yeah, so in terms of what Susan's saying, I don't agree that it's the idea of serving God, because at this point, at the embryonic state, the soul does not yet have a full relationship with the body. And the idea of actually serving God only happens once the soul and body are united. But is there something going on godly? Absolutely. You know, that there's no question whatsoever. The Talmud talks about the fact that the soul in the while the baby is still in the embryonic state, the soul is studying Torah with God himself and preparing himself basically for coming out in the world. So there's definitely something spiritual going on there, but it's not service of God, because service of God we define by work, by actual avodah, by actual, you know, there's something difficult going on. We mentioned in Lote Meshakela that the idea of avodah comes from the idea of working leather, which takes a tremendous amount of effort, because service of God is not just checking the boxes, it is the actual effort that the person puts in. So in terms of that effort, the whole idea of this first stage of nullification, of making oneself an empty vessel, that's true on any person's level. It doesn't make a difference who the person is, where the person is. A person could be on the highest of spiritual levels, and they still need to go through that same process. And the Rebbe pointed out in Lotim Meshakela that even somebody on the highest of levels, as soon as they start feeling self-satisfied, they are jumping off the boat, because then they're doing something for themselves, they're not doing for God. Total devotion is this higher level of nullification that we speak about when in bshaa shekhikdimu, the later stage of receiving the Torah, and that is this highest level in which a person is able to constantly push themselves to grow on a total constant basis. But this only happens when we take into mind the whole idea of sovev, because sovev is what we described as the great equalizer. Because of the fact that big and small don't exist in its presence, it is truly infinite in the way that you can't compare anything. The same way the number 5 and the number 5 billion have nothing to do with each other, you know, conceptually. They're obviously very far away from each other, but when looked at on an infinite continuum, they're total equals. Because on the infinite continuum, they're both limited factors. And so the same thing with regards to sovev. Sovev can become our trajectory into service of God when we realize that no matter how big we are now, no matter how small we are, God chose us to serve. And so therefore, it's not about us. It's about the fact that we make the choice to serve. It's about the fact that we make the choice to do something towards that connection. And with regards to that, as small as it might be, as big as it might be, it's all about the connection. So that was, again, you know, several themes and several maimarim that really kind of go around each other, that, you know, that meander through their particular, each essay, each maimar had its own conversation, but these concepts, when you start applying them all through all of them, they clarify themselves throughout each one of the maimarim. Then we spoke about a little bit about the differences between the Jewish perspective and the non-Jewish perspective. We said that the Jewish perspective is, again, taking into account this concept of total transcendence and the ability to transcend even the transcendence, whereas the non-Jewish approach is very much relative to the world and stuck within the parameters of the world. That was this idea that we discussed, the concept of that the non-Jews are referred to as avodat ovdei chama, that they serve the sun. And we explained the reason why they serve the sun is not just because the sun gives them warmth, gives them nutrition, gives them vitality and all that, but they perceive the results of the sun. And the word chama means heat. So that what they're looking at is that they're thankful for the things that they receive instead of recognizing that the sun is just a tool in God's hands. And so therefore we explained that the non-Jewish and specifically the Greek approach, the hedonistic approach, is to be serving those feelings of physicality, to be involved with and invested in the pleasures of the world, the results of what you get, instead of the purpose. And the Jewish approach is to focus, like we said before, the idea of ani lo nivreti ela l'shamesh et koni, to focus on why I was created and how to apply everything in my life into creation, into service of God. And that itself relates to something else that we said, in prayer, we go upwards. We start on a very, very basic level, and then we think about God, we think about God's interaction with the world, we think about how beautiful the world is and how God gives life to all of creation. Then we go talk about the angels and the souls and Shema Yisrael itself. Then we get to the Amidah, and we say at the Amidah, God, open my lips and let my mouth speak your praise. And we said that speak your praise also means to draw down your praise. And what we understood from that is that what we're asking for God in the prayers of the Amidah are actually for the purpose of serving God himself. So we're not asking God for, a house, just for the purpose of having a house and, being able to show off to our friends. We're asking for the purpose of being able to use it in the service of God. And so again, once again, the idea that's discussed in the Maimer of Tanu Rabbanan Ner Chanukah is very much related to some of the ideas that we discussed in, I think it was Natata L'Recha Nes Litno 6. I don't remember exactly which one it was, but the point of the matter is that the concepts are very much relevant to each other, that we realize that our prayer needs to be focused not on ourselves, not on us receiving things because that's what we want, but on our service of God. And once again, that's completely relevant to any person, no matter where they are, no matter their spiritual circumstances, no matter their financial or any kind of circumstances. Reminds me, just on the side, there was a chassid of the Alter Rebbe, whose name was Reb Pinchas Reitzes. He was a very, very well-known, significant Talmudic scholar, and he was also very wealthy. And he went and bought himself a stone house, and then, of course, in Tsarist Russia, back then, generally speaking, the Jewish people had wooden houses, and to buy yourself a stone house, a stone mansion, even was considered to be the height of who do you think you are, kind of thing. And so people asked him about it. They said, this is not like you at all to do something like this. And his response was, because I bought this house, therefore the town meetings are going to happen in my house. And that way, I will be able to influence the town meetings in such a way that will be better for the Jews. That kind of approach the recognition that, okay, I don't want this for myself, but I'm doing this for everybody else, is very, very much something that we need to consider for ourselves. It is good to have, to be comfortable. But what's the purpose of being comfortable? So the interesting follow-up of the story was that one of his friends came to visit him. This was the famous jokester, but a really, really an incredible character himself. Come on. I'm forgetting his name at the second. Totally out of my head for the second. And he came to visit. He didn't even knock on the door. He walked straight in, and he got onto the couch and laid down on the couch with his feet up. And as you can imagine, back in the 1750s, the roads were not exactly as clean as they are nowadays, and so he had his dirty boots on the couch. So Reb Pinchas's wife said to her husband, can you at least ask him to take his boots off before he comes in the house? So Reb Pinchas comes over to him and apologizes and says, listen, it's really phenomenal to see you, but if you're gonna come into my house, and sit on the couch, no problem whatsoever. Your house, my house is your house. Make yourself out. Just please take your boots off. And he stood up and said, Pinchas, here I thought you were totally focused on God. And what I really see is you're focused on yourself. You're focused on materialism. And he started marching out of the house. And Pinchas realized that he had kind of allowed the materialism to slightly seep into his heart. And so he started apologizing to his friend. He said, what can I do to make up for it? Now, this is something that we would not suggest nowadays. But again, his friend was a little bit of a prankster.
Was his name Pluni?
What was that?
Was his name Pluni?
No.
Not Pluni. No.
No.
Okay.
Reb Shmuel Munkis was his name. There we go. So Reb Shmuel Munkis tells his friend Reb Pinchas, he says, in order to be able to completely eradicate your sense of self, you need to take the broom from the kitchen and run around the marketplace as if you were playing horsey like a 6-year-old. So this is not something that we would suggest in any way whatsoever. But you can imagine basically somebody who's a well-known Torah scholar, a well-known businessman, he's an important member of the community, and for him to do such a thing, and without asking any questions, he immediately did that. People laughed about it. People spoke about it for several days, and they forgot about it later. But he basically took it on himself. He said, I need to eradicate any element of ego, of self-focus in myself. So he agreed to do that for that particular in that particular way. I would not suggest that nowadays. I'm saying this is not a standard operating procedure. But the purpose of the story is not the horsey element of the story, but the idea that Reb Pinchas was number one, trying to focus his life on the purpose of his money, the purpose of the creation, as opposed to self-focus. And when Rabbi Shmuel Munkis wanted to realign him, he brought him back into that place in obviously a humorous way, but to be able to bring him to the point where he could realize, the truth of the matter is that, what's the difference between you and a 6-year-old child? When you break it down on the largest scheme of things, really, on the most intense way of looking at things from God's greatest perspective, there's really no difference between anybody. You're not so big. You're not so special. And that was the message that he was trying to impart to Reb Pinchas. And Pinchas legitimately received it, of course. But for ourselves, we need to understand that idea, this concept that's completely going through these several Maimarim, the idea that service of God is our entire creation, That's who we are, no matter what our job is or was, what our career is or was, what our what our successes are, what our failures are, our religiosity, so to speak, or our lack of, where we find ourselves in any circumstance. When we take the idea of Soviv, the idea of God's transcendence, and say, despite anything, despite any of these details, God chose me to serve him. And in any circumstance, by doing teshuvah, by connecting to God on God's deepest level, by returning to God, by returning to my source, we're able to elicit the transcendent and completely connect. And so that's a second concept that we can you can see again thematically that kind of meanders throughout these Maimarim. Any comments or questions on that before I hand the mic over to Rabbi Smith? That's all.
Yashikaya.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Baruch
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.